Good morning and welcome to the 40th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Apologies have been received from Richard Lyle and Colin Beattie. We turn now to the item on our agenda for this morning, which is to do with BIFAB, the offshore wind sector and the Scottish supply chain. Now, I'm pleased this morning to introduce our witnesses. The first off, Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, MP, Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. He is joined by his official, Sarah Redwood, who is the Director of Renewable Energy Deployment at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So I'll invite the Minister now to make a short opening statement, whereafter we'll go straight to questions from Committee Member Maurice Golden, who will then be followed by questions from Alex Rowley. So, Minister.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. The UK has set out a bold, low-carbon future where offshore wind will play a central part. The recent announcements on increasing our ambition to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the 10-point plan, which covers renewables, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and also capping it all, the recent energy white paper, I think sets out the level of ambition and the scale of deployment that we want to see in this crucial area. However, I am also mindful of the difficult situation at BIFAB. I think it's a sad time for everybody employed at BIFAB that they've now entered administration, and I'm fully aware of the uncertainty that that situation will bring. The BIFAB situation is complex, but we do hope that the administrators can help the company come out of this in a much stronger fashion. I also welcome Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary's statement last week, which provided support for workers during the administration process. I believe that there are considerable opportunities available for any new owner. I also want to stress in these opening remarks the economic opportunity that we have across the UK in driving not only the net zero agenda, but also in creating potentially huge numbers of jobs for people within the UK, not least in Scotland. I think it's absolutely important to do this, that we can develop a competitive supply chain, and we need to focus on where the UK can be competitive. We cannot mandate UK content, but we can certainly support companies by creating a healthy market. And I'm ensuring this in my role by trying to create a policy framework which supports UK companies. And that is why we published our consultation on strengthening the supply chain policy in the CFD mechanism, and also raises the possibility of real penalties in the case of non-compliance. We're always reviewing how the CFD works. It's been very successful. I'm sure I'll have more questions about it. But the important thing to remember is that in 5 years, the CFD has reduced, in offshore wind, has reduced the cost of offshore wind from £114 per megawatt hour in 2015 to £39.50 roughly, £39 per megawatt hour in 2019. That's in 4 years, and it's more than a 60% decrease in cost, and that's something that we must always bear in mind when we discuss CFDs. Last week, we published a call for evidence, and this was asking for thoughts and facts, evidence, as to how the CFD scheme can achieve sustainable growth, cost reduction that I alluded to, and also ensure that the UK supply chain is competitive. I've started just this summer, 6 months ago now actually, a series of roundtables with industry precisely to identify how the supply chain is put together and how best we can ensure that UK content is competitive and that we can reach our sector deal target of 60% of UK content in the supply chain for offshore wind. Examples of improvements of new developments are tower proposal in Nig by Hazia, the Spanish firm, and also we have a very good understanding with SIA, South Korean firm, as to their investment and their ability, their willingness to support UK manufacturing here on our shores. We also announced very recently £160 million for ports and offshore wind manufacturing, which will help, which I describe as enabling infrastructure. It's enabling infrastructure because it'll help to support the next generation of manufacturing, which can drive further opportunities in the UK supply chain. So the supply chain is something that we're very, very directly focused on. And we hope that we can, in the fourth auction round next year, really deliver on the promise of 60% of UK supply, of UK content in the supply chain in offshore wind. Broadly, and I'll just finish with this, I think we're at a remarkable time for renewables and for the UK. When I look at offshore wind, I see that we have 35% of global capacity. We've reduced the costs in the way that I've described. And I think this is an area in which the United Kingdom and also all the devolved nations can really have an opportunity to drive economic growth and to drive success and wealth creation and critically job creation. So thank you very much for allowing me to have this statement, and I look forward to your questions in the course of the committee's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now questions from committee member Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome, Minister. I'd like to ask you, and you touched on it in your statement, around contracts for difference, and what is your assessment of how the CFD system has delivered for the offshore wind sector?
I think the first thing, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, is that the CFD has been hugely successful. And people around the world, energy ministers around the world, are always asking me about it. We review the facts. In 2015, the first round was £114 per megawatt hour. Only last year, we reduced this to £39 per megawatt hour, which is 2/3 cheaper in 4 years. If you look at the installed capacity of offshore wind here in the UK, it's something like 11 gigawatts, 12 gigawatts, in fact. And that represents 35% of the global total. And people across the world, manufacturers, are looking at the CFD here in the UK as something which has been very successful, and they want to compete in it. Now, one of the issues that is critically important is the UK content in the supply chain, and I know that that's something which is of great interest to your committee, but also is something that's of huge importance to the government, because we want to ensure that, given the growth of the offshore wind sector, we can actually create jobs, skills, and talent, and nurture talent here in the UK. And that's why in the sector deal, we have this 60% UK supply chain, UK content requirement or goal for the supply chain in offshore wind.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's welcome going forward in terms of looking at the supply chain and for us in Scotland, the Scottish supply chain. When thinking about, in the context of BIFAB, the Scottish supply chain to date under the current CFD model, do you think there was an opportunity cost for going for lower cost versus supply chain jobs, or what is your assessment of that balancing act?
I don't think that's the case. I mean, obviously there's a tension between trying to increase supply and increase capacity, and doing that in a cost-effective way. As I've said, and I can't repeat enough times, the decline in cost of the offshore wind per megawatt hour has been significant and has been noted around the world. It started off, as I said, at £114, has gone down to £39. But even within that, there is still huge opportunity for UK content and UK companies to succeed in that. We've got, as I said in my opening remarks, potential discussions with Hazia in NIG in terms of a tower facility. I speak regularly with South Korean firms, with GE Renewables, and other companies all of them are looking to site manufacturing plants here in the UK and also in Scotland, here in England and also in Scotland, across the UK. So it's a real opportunity for the United Kingdom and for creating jobs in a growing sector.
Thank you, Minister. Just to clarify, you see, the benefits of the driving down the cost, and going forward, you see that it's compatible to have low-cost energy generation with supply chain jobs.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why people are drawn to our CFD round. When I speak to companies like GE Renewables, when I speak to SIA, South Korean manufacturing firm, and other companies, MHI Vestas, they're all looking to make investments in the UK because they realize that this is the biggest show in the world in terms of offshore wind, and they want to be part of that market. Our job, and we're doing this increasingly effectively, is to make sure that they deliver on UK jobs and UK content. And I think the people in Scotland, manufacturing base in Scotland, has a huge opportunity in driving that.
Thank you, Minister. And final question, just on your last point regarding supply chains. Have you had any issues of businesses deviating from these plans?
No. I mean, obviously, a lot of the plans will be seeing the proof of the pudding, as they say, will be in the eating. And we're hopeful to see the auction round 4. We'll see the auction round 4 at the end of next year. And I'm sure that in that process, we'll have lots of discussions as to how we can meet the supply chain target. But the conversations that I've had, people recognize that we're very, very serious about driving the UK content in the supply chain. And I think the most far-sighted companies are very willing to work with us on this.
Thank you, Minister. That's excellent. And thank you, Convener.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, questions from Alex Rowley.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, Minister. Could I maybe pick up firstly on a couple of points that you've made in terms of your opening remarks? You say that we cannot mandate work into the supply chain. Now, we've heard evidence over the last few weeks for a number of different sources, a number of different expertise in this field, that in Asia, Europe cannot compete when it comes to the fabrication of the jackets, etc. And we've been told that it could be anything between 15 to 25% cheaper cost-wise in Asia than it is in Europe. And that's put down to state subsidies in a lot of these countries. So state aid being provided to these companies, low wages, poor health and safety conditions. All these issues mean that Europe just cannot compete with some of these yards in Asia. So the question is, if that is the case, how is it then that, for example, France, because we've heard evidence that France does mandate companies where they're applying for work to do work in France, and we've heard evidence that Canada does exactly that. They mandate companies for a certain percentage of the supply chain work to go to their country. So the question, I suppose, is how can these other countries in Europe and in Canada mandate for the work to go to the supply chain of the local country, and yet you're saying we can't?
What I'm saying, Mr. Rowley, I mean, there are two issues that you raised there. You said firstly that people are saying that Europe can't compete, which isn't true, because you yourself have said that the French are mandating French content. So in a sense, that argues against the idea that Europe can't compete. And particularly, what I'm saying is that there are state aid rules, not only in the EU, but there are also WTO rules. And those rules are very clear, and the British government will always try and follow those rules. Having said all of that, I am saying that we can encourage greater UK content. And the conversations I'm having with companies like SIA in South Korea, the conversations the Scottish government itself is having with Hazia, a Spanish company, looking at tower installations, tower plant in Nig. All of these things suggest that we are doing a good job in encouraging people to invest in our supply chain, and that we can actually deliver results in this. So I dispute the idea that Europe can't compete. And I also think that we have to be mindful of WTO rules. But even within that constraint, we're doing a very energetic job in trying to drive UK supply chain content. And all the discussions I'm having with people like GE Renewables, with SEA and other companies suggest there's a real appetite to invest in the UK and to invest in British workers, essentially driving capacity in the offshore wind market.
I suppose my point was basically that if the evidence is that these companies in Asia are at least 15 to 20% cheaper than Europe, and France, despite that, France is making clear that if you want a contract in France, then you will need to put the work and do the work in France. Then there's a question there that's been repeatedly asked. I speak to you today from Fife, about 10 miles from 2 fabrication yards that are lying empty, despite the fact that we have about 10 miles off our coast a major wind farm being built, and all the rigs for that are being transported halfway around the world. I'm sure you can see why people in Fife and in Scotland, I think, are fairly sceptical when you talk about all these jobs that are going to come through the supply chain for offshore renewable energy.
Look, I hear what you're saying. I have to say, I think you're looking at the glass being half empty, when in fact offshore wind, and I know people in your constituencies will appreciate it, offshore wind has been a huge British success story. I mean, as I said, and it wasn't even noticed in your remarks, Mr. Rowley, is that we have 35% of global capacity. I can't think of any other industry where we have such a clear global leading position. Having said that, we can do better in trying to ensure that UK supply chain, that the content is higher. And I've outlined the way in which I think that this can be achieved. I think we're looking at the auction round, we're doing a consultation, and we're trying to look at ways we can encourage, and in some cases penalise, companies that don't deliver on UK supply chain. I also said that the proof of the pudding will be the eating. I think we can look at the 4th auction round at the end of next year and see the conclusion of it. But I think we are doing all we can to make sure that the UK content is actually increased in this very vibrant and hitherto very successful for the UK industry.
So the follow-up to that really would be, can you tell the committee what proportion of the turbines and jackets currently in Scottish waters have been fabricated or manufactured in Scotland, or for that matter, in the UK?
I can't tell you the exact figure of that, but I can say that element, that content, will be increasing. I mentioned in my opening remarks that we're running a competition for £160 million of funding for ports. That is enabling infrastructure that will enable wind turbine manufacturers, for instance, to locate here in the UK. I've said that we're consulting about the CFD process itself to see how we can bring in further sanctions or penalties or encouragements, incentives for driving UK content. And I can't, more than that, I can't promise. But I'm saying that we are very, very focused on this, and I know you're going to bring up. Sorry.
No. Finally, then, I wonder if we did a comparison with another area like clean energy, nuclear, and the decision that was taken there in terms of the nuclear power stations to build them. I mean, firstly, in terms of the megawatt hour, I mean, I agree with you, but even when it was 114 pounds per megawatt hour, we still weren't getting the manufacturing work coming to Scotland. So driving that down to 39. I wonder what the change is, but what does it cost for nuclear? And is there supply chain agreements in place? Because I met with the trade unions on Friday, and they tell me that the government, the trade unions, all got together in a room with the contractors and set out very clearly that there needed to be supply chain work coming for the nuclear sector. So if we did a comparison with clean energy and nuclear and clean energy in terms of renewables, there seems to be something that's went wrong with renewables.
With renewables, your question is
supply chain, do you accept that the supply chain is there for the nuclear work that's coming into the country?
That's another area where we want to drive UK supply chain in nuclear manufacturing. And if you go to Hinkley Point, you'll see they've created something like 10,000 new jobs. And people in Somerset are very engaged and excited by the opportunities, the economic opportunities, the job opportunities in Hinkley Point. But you're quite right. We need to also attempt to drive up UK content in the nuclear industry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We now come to questions from Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. It's been widely recognised that Scotland's the windiest country in Europe, and you've already highlighted, the situation where I think it was 35% of the global resource is in the UK. Well, by calculations, Scotland must be the windiest city in the world based on that calculation. So what I was wanting to ask was, given that we've got this huge wind resource, why is it in each of the last 3 rounds of CFD that the Scottish content is reduced?
Well, I don't know about the precise details of the Scottish content. What I would say is that SSE and Scottish Power are big players in this sector, and they obviously have origins in Scotland. And I also know that there's a huge amount of interest in offshore wind across Scotland. I've just spoken to the Stornoway Trust, and they are very, very keen on driving remote island wind. And I'm very pleased to announce and have announced that the remote island wind contracts will be in their own pot. And there's a huge opportunity for Scottish manufacturing and Scottish workers to engage in driving up offshore wind capacity.
Yeah, from memory, I think the figure has fallen from 30% to 4% as the Scottish content.
I don't know how you've calculated that, and of course the 40% will be a much smaller portion. The 40% is a bigger portion of a much smaller number, given the increase in capacity. But I'd be very happy to come back to you on that.
Okay, that would be good. In terms of, what can you do to reverse that trend? You keep talking about the 60% of UK content that you hope to achieve. How are you going to go about doing that?
Well, we're already trying to achieve it. I don't want to, you shouldn't denigrate the efforts of the Scottish government. They're speaking to Hazia, which is a Spanish company, precisely about locating a tower centre plant in Nig in the Highlands of Scotland. I have spoken, as I've said repeatedly, to GE Renewables, who make wind turbines. I've spoken to MHI Vestas, who make wind turbines in the Isle of Wight blades. Essentially, I've spoken to the South Korean firm SEA, who are making monopiles. And we are conversing all the time with potential investors who see the UK as a great market. Now, you can castigate us for that, but that seems unfair to me. We're doing a lot to try and attract investment in what is a British success story.
So in terms of this 60% that you keep referring to in the supply chain being produced in the UK, can we have 60% of written into contracts that will be 60% in Scotland?
That's something which we talk to our friends in the Scottish government. We talk to people across the UK about how we can focus on increasing the content. But you'll understand the UK government has to have a sector deal based on the entirety of the UK. I think if the Scottish government wanted to go down another route, they would have to convert. We would have to have a conversation with them about that. But the UK government, the supply chain requirement is a UK requirement.
So my understanding is that UK competition law would stop Scotland actually specifying that a proportion of jobs had to be in Scotland. And one of the reasons for that concern is that the majority of oil and gas is based in Scottish territorial waters, and we're in a situation where only 39% of the jobs are actually in Scotland. Now, I accept that you can never have 100% of the jobs located in Scotland, but there seems to be a disparity there, and if UK competition law stops you from writing into a contract that a specific amount of work should be produced in Scotland, are we not just going to replicate the situation that's taking place in the North Sea?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. As I've said, in terms of power distribution, in terms of offshore wind capacity, two of the biggest companies that we know, SSE and Scottish Power, have their roots very firmly in Scotland. I'd like to refer to Sarah Redwood, who's an official who can talk more about the competition law aspects, perhaps. But I'd be very happy to engage with you on this subject subsequent to her remarks.
Thank you. So absolutely.
Sarah Redwood, please.
Thank you. So yeah, we can't sort of specify absolute details on UK content in the contracts, as we've mentioned earlier. However, we're doing lots with the Scottish Government and with the Scottish industry as well to look at where the opportunities lie. So, for example, there's an offshore wind strategic investment assessment taking place, which is chaired by Professor Sir Jim MacDonald, which is looking at exactly what are the opportunities in Scotland for the supply chain. And that is reporting in spring of next year to look at which parts of the supply chain could be boosted further. And that's all about how can we make sure that the UK is a really competitive place to do business and is a place of choice for manufacturers to come and base themselves and invest and create those economic opportunities.
Thank you, Sarah.
So I've only got a couple of minutes left, so just to move on to my final point. When contracts for difference were introduced, it was said that the aim was to produce the cheapest electricity in Europe. Looking back at the numbers, electricity in Scotland has risen 31% since 2010, which is in line with inflation. And the EU Energy Committee that reports every 2 years comparing the electricity prices across 30 countries has highlighted that the UK is in the top 10 most expensive places of those 30 countries in Europe that were compared. So where are we getting the argument that this is benefiting consumers?
I think you're being a bit unfair. I mean, one of the things that we've driven is the net zero challenge. We're the only country in Europe that has legislated for net zero by 2050. We have decarbonised our sources of electricity to a far greater extent than any other country in Europe. And hitherto, until now, there have been policy costs related to that. We're looking at trying to reduce electricity costs. No one can argue that the CFD rounds haven't significantly decreased costs. And we have a very strict decarbonisation agenda, as your own government in Scotland does. By 2045, in Germany, they're not even going to get coal off the grid until 2038 in Germany. So, there is a huge amount of work that we're doing in terms of trying to balance reduction in costs as well as hitting climate change carbon decarbonisation targets. And I think we're doing that very effectively.
All right, thank you, Minister. We'll now move on to questions from Andy Whiteman. Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome, Minister. A couple of my colleagues touched on questions about information and data on UK and, as a subset of that, Scottish content in offshore renewables. Just to clarify, do you have that data?
I have access to that data. I don't have it at the top of my head, but it's something that I'm reviewing all the time.
Yes, no, I wasn't meaning to suggest you have it literally in front of it, but the UK government has that data on the amount of UK content in contracts for difference contracts. Is that correct? That information
yes,
is
that's one of the reasons why we've set ourselves a 60%, and we know that we're falling short. From the top of my head, I think it was about 45%, but I'd have to go back to that. But we're very conscious that we need to drive up that UK content, and that's been very much at the centre of what I've been saying this morning.
Okay, that's useful. Now, you mentioned you've been in conversation with some overseas companies from South Korea, etc. Can you say a little bit more about the nature of those conversations and how likely it is and the scale of the kind of investment that might take place in the UK?
Well, obviously, everyone in the world in this space knows about the UK's net zero commitment in law, which we passed last year. They know about the CFD rounds, and they're very interested, given our leading position at the moment in offshore wind capacity. They're interested in investing in the UK, and it would be quite natural for them to try and understand, where our policy is heading. And in that, we've given them a huge amount of reassurance. As I said, we've upped our target to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And in that is carved out 1 gigawatt for floating offshore wind, which I think has opportunities in Scotland as well. We reasserted that in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan and also in the Energy White Paper, which only came a week ago. So all of these conversations that we've been having have also been reinforced by a lot of the policy work that we've published. And even more people, I think, even more operators and manufacturers around the world are being attracted to the UK market. So you can understand that my time is very busy, and I speak to these companies all the time.
Okay, thanks very much. You mentioned floating offshore wind target to 1 gigawatt by 2030. Does the UK actually have the capacity, skills and expertise to meet this aim, and what plans does the UK government have to ensure it is met?
I think that's a good question. I think we absolutely have the innovation and the skills to do this. And if we wind the clock back even just 8 years ago, if you'd said to anyone in 2012 that we would have 12 gigawatts, nearly 12 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2020, they simply wouldn't have believed that. So I think if that was the case 8 years ago, in 10 years' time, having 1 gigawatt of floating offshore wind is eminently achievable. And we do have the skills and the know-how to be able to achieve it.
Thank you. And in your review of the contract for difference process, to what extent could environmental and fair work conditions be built into that?
I think that's really important. And one thing that I'm sure the committee understands, but I need to reiterate, is the fact that all of these decisions have planning implications, and all of the green lights, if you like, are given after a serious and rigorous process in which environmental concerns are really, really foremost. The other thing I would say in terms of workers' conditions is that I have a very good relationship with the trades unions. I speak to trade union leaders on a regular basis. And I'm very much of the view that there's no way we can get to net zero without really good dialogue and communication across the whole of the economy. And that's why jobs, wealth creation, the condition of workers is really, really important in this whole process. And I think we have had some success in this.
Thank you, Convener.
All right, thank you. Now questions from Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. It's good to see you.
Hello.
Hi. You mentioned earlier, I just want to go back on a couple of things you've mentioned previously. You mentioned WTO rules. Of course, we're not yet sure whether we'll get a deal with the EU or we'll be subject to WTO rules. But if we are, what exactly are they in this sphere?
Well, you'll know that, Graham, that there are rules about competition in order to ensure kind of equal basis of trade. And there are rules about state aid and subsidies that governments can give to various industries. They're complex rules, there's a complex schedule. But you can't simply just subsidize whichever industries you want to a huge extent. And if you do that, you will be liable to a legal process. And that's particularly the case within the EU, but it's also the case with the WTO. And all I was saying generally was that our law, our competition, our CFD rounds are in some way constrained by these other international legal requirements.
Okay, that's very useful. Can I ask you about the £160 million fund to develop ports, which you mentioned earlier, and I was reading about in the white paper. I think I'm right in saying that's UK wide, isn't it?
Absolutely right. It's absolutely UK wide, and I think some of the ports, some of the infrastructure in Scotland is in an extremely good place, powerful place to benefit from that. The companies I speak to that I've referred to have all expressed interest in Scottish investing in Scottish infrastructure, ports, and I think there is an opportunity for Scotland. I mean, I don't need to name individual ports, but they're well known.
Okay. But you've had interest from Scotland, have you, in this?
No, I've had interest from companies across the world who are particularly interested in Scottish investment, in investing in Scotland. I've mentioned Hazia and NIG as well, their potential investment there. I've mentioned that. But there are other companies as well who are interested in places like, for instance, Rosyth. People are interested in the prospect of carbon capture and the Acorn site. There are lots of potential areas of investment within Scotland, and I think this is a great opportunity for Scotland.
Okay, I mean the white paper has a figure of you say that 60,000 direct and indirect jobs could be supported by the offshore wind sector by 2030, which is quite some figure. And I assume I mean it's very impressive if it's deliverable. How convinced that it is?
I think I am confident, but it's not just about offshore wind. I mean, important though that is, there are opportunities in carbon capture and storage where we want to have 4 clusters by 2030. We upped our commitment and ambition in that area. There are opportunities for Scotland in the development of hydrogen, and in fact, there are ongoing trials of hydrogen in Scotland itself at the moment. And I think that's, again, another huge opportunity for the Scottish economy and for Scottish talent and innovation and skills.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, certainly on hydrogen, but I suppose it's early days, isn't it?
Well, it is early days, but I mean, these trials are happening as we speak, and I think that there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just go back to something that we touched on earlier. I mean, we as a committee, we heard that BiFab lost out on contracts to contractors based in Europe and further afield, the Far East, Middle East. But it also includes European companies that are state-backed. Why do you think state ownership appears to be an option for Spain but not the UK?
I don't think that state ownership is something that can be just given, or state support on a blanket basis. I was very struck by the fact that Fiona Hislop outlined very clearly to the Scottish Parliament the reasons why the Scottish Government didn't feel they could increase their exposure, increase their investment in BiFab. And she put it very clearly. I think her statement, as I recall, she said that central government spending, government funding, had to be done on the basis of a commercial proposition. And in the case of BiFab, the majority shareholder, think about it, the majority shareholder, JV Driver, refused to put any more money in. And she, quite rightly, I think, as far as many people are concerned, said, well, if the majority shareholder isn't prepared to put up money in the first instance, why should the Scottish Government, which was a minority shareholder, do so? But having said all of that, we are looking, the UK Government and the Scottish Government are looking at a joint committee to see whether the company can really navigate this difficult situation and emerge much stronger as a consequence. But she made a fair point about the fact that the majority shareholder was unwilling to put their money where their mouth was and support the company.
Yeah, they certainly were unwilling to put in any money. They put in hardly any money. About £4 is all they put in. So it was not very impressive from them. So just one final question, if I may. You mentioned that the joint committee, has that met yet?
My understanding is that it hasn't, but I'm not sure. I don't know, so I'll need to get back to you on that. It's something that's run out of Cabinet Office here in the UK, and they're coming together with the committee. So I'd have to find out more about that.
That would be useful if you could tell us when it's due to meet and perhaps who's on it as well. That'd be great.
Sure.
So that's all for me, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. No questions from the Deputy Convener, Wilie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to you, Minister. I wonder if I could just pick up that point, the previous point that was being made there in relation to BIFAB. Is it your view, shared view with the Scottish Government, that further state aid intervention to help BIFAB just wasn't possible to be done?
It was their call, and I think Fiona Hislop gave an insight into the Scottish Government's thinking on this subject only 5 days ago, and I've read her statement very carefully. I think it was ably presented and had some cogent arguments in it, but it was very much their call. They were essentially asked to provide funding for it, and they didn't do so. And the rationale was that the majority shareholder had declined to do so. So those are the reasons that she gave. People can take them as they find them. But it was clearly a decision of the Scottish Government not to supply any more finance at this point to the company.
Do you agree with that position that's been taken?
From my point of view, if I'd seen the numbers, and I'd looked at the company, and I have looked at the company, and I saw that the majority shareholder was unwilling to provide any more finance, I would ask questions as to, well, if the majority shareholder doesn't provide any more finance, they clearly have a reluctance to do so, and they don't feel that it's commercially viable. I think that does ask questions about minority shareholders. And I have her remarks in front of me, and she put it very well. Investment by government must be made on the same basis as that of a commercial investor, and that's a very clear statement from her, and that explains why, in this instance, the Scottish Government were reluctant to provide that kind of support to the company.
Okay. Just looking ahead, if I can, Minister, to, well, the next 10 days. We've got a letter from the Cabinet Secretary this morning, obviously reminding us that we'll no longer be part of the whole competition system from the 1st of January. But she's also saying to us in the letter that the UK Government has yet to provide guidance on what any new state aid or subsidy regime in the UK might look like, and that the UK Government hasn't consulted with Scottish ministers on the design of that. Could you offer us a few comments on this, please? Given the urgency of the situation.
I mean, I don't know what conversations every colleague of mine across the UK Government has had with the Scottish Government. I think state aid is something which is obviously of huge importance for the UK. There are also conversations and issues around the UK internal market as well, which are very relevant to the Scottish Government. So I can't possibly comment on conversations that other members of the British Government have had, the UK Government have had with Scottish ministers or officials.
Okay, but would you at least be willing to say that in designing what that new arrangement might look like, you would be committing to consult with Scottish ministers on
all I can talk about is what I've done and what the department does. I have very frequent quadrilateral meetings between myself and my my opposite numbers, as it were, across the devolved administrations. I speak to Rosanna Cunningham frequently. I speak to Paul Wheelhouse very frequently. And I would assume that those kinds of conversations are held by other ministers in the UK Government with their counterparts in Scotland. And I'm sure that that subject would be raised in those conversations.
Okay. I mean, they do say there is a good relationship developing there, so please don't get me wrong. We're just trying to get a solution, and we've got 10 days to go, and we don't know what it is. Just looking ahead again.
But I think there is extensive conversations between the UK government and Holyrood, and I feel that from a personal point of view, that relationship has developed very, very well over the last year. And we share ideas, we share views very freely, and not only with Scottish counterparts, but with Leslie Griffiths as well in Wales and the Northern Ireland Executive. It's a very good forum to exchange ideas and views. One success, I think, dare I say it, was with the UK ETS scheme, where devolved colleagues expressed their views very clearly about their preference for a standalone UK ETS in the first instance. And we managed to land that result, and the Prime Minister announced that last week. So that's a very good example in which conversations, the sharing, exchange of ideas, actually led to an outcome that people were generally pleased with.
Okay, just finally from me, Minister, I know there's limited time remaining. Again, just looking ahead, though, could you share any views at all about how you see competition being regulated or managed beyond the 1st of January, let's call it now? How do you plan to manage kind of intra-UK competition that will clearly be possible to take place?
So are you talking about competition across the whole economy, or just within my own portfolio?
Well, in your own portfolio, obviously. How do you see?
Well, energy is obviously a highly regulated market. We have Ofgem, which is the regulator, which is independent of government. And as far as my conversations with Jonathan Brearley and his team in Ofgem are concerned, they are quite confident that they can regulate the market, they can drive a degree of competition to make sure that consumers get fair prices. And they also have to juggle the fact that we need to attract investment into the energy sector, and they feel that they can do that, and I'm confident that can happen as well. I speak to SSE, Scottish Power, National Grid. All of them are committed to the kind of investment that we all want to see in the UK.
Okay, thanks you very much for your contribution and coming to talk to us at the committee. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. I think, did Sarah Redwood want to come in with one or two comments on what was said there?
It was just to pick up on a couple of questions. So one that Graham Simpson had raised, and it was to clarify that the working group between the Scottish Government and UK Government officials has met twice to talk about the BiFab site and the supply chains. So that has occurred twice, and that's reporting to both Scottish Government and the UK Government on that basis. And to pick up on the question that Gordon's raised about the ports competition, we published a request for information at the start of October that the 4 ports responded to. We're not having open conversations with the developers while the competition is running, because that would not be appropriate. The competition runs until the 8th of January. So hopefully that clarifies a couple of the questions.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Just a few questions from me, if I may, Minister, as we head towards the end of our session. You mentioned planning implications in one of your comments, and I suppose that in terms of delivering offshore wind projects, and also in terms of contractual obligations or statements of intention or enforceability, to a certain extent that depends on the local system. And of course in Scotland we have our own local planning system, as in England there's a different one. Can you expand on that? Because I suppose one has to have both the actual ability to drive projects forward and the framework that they can prosper within, and also the political will to actually push these forward or assist pushing them forward.
Look, I think that's a fair question, but I mean, if I may answer the question broadly, very broadly, anyone can see that if we've got 12 gigawatts today of offshore wind capacity, roughly, any attempt to get to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, in 10 years' time, will have huge implications in terms of not only the building of the physical plant, the physical offshore wind farms, but also on the planning process. And that's something that we're looking at very closely. And one of the issues that has been raised with regard to the 40 gigawatts, and it's very relevant to planning, is the fact that if you just have point-to-point cables from the offshore wind farm to the shore, that requires a lot of point-to-point installations, which will have an environmental impact on the coast of the UK. So we're looking at things like having an offshore network transmission system, an offshore transmission network. And I have called for an inquiry, a look into that, a review rather of that policy this summer. And we're looking at ways in which we can mitigate the environmental impact of having all of this offshore wind capacity and transmitting it to the island, to the island of Great Britain in the first instance. So that sort of thing means that planning does become a big issue. Environmentalists have raised concerns about wildlife, about the impact of offshore wind farms on migratory birds, on the impact of those installations on the seabed and crustaceans and mollusks. And all of these things are things that we take very seriously. So there are big planning issues that are raised, but we hope to be able to meet those concerns while also delivering the target. So it's tricky, involves a lot of conversation, but we feel that there is a path to doing that in the best way, that it protects our environment and also protects the safety of people who work in the industry.
Thank you. Yes, and you also commented or asked about the question of whether or not one can require a certain amount of Scottish content or British content. You rightly pointed out that it's not just the EU rules at the minute which will cease to apply, or maybe a different alternative in the new year, but also the World Trade Organization rules. But I suppose there is another way of looking at it, that it's not simply about a blunt requirement to include so much percentage or value of Scottish or UK content, but there can be requirements that are relevant and would be allowed both under WTO and indeed the EU rules, requiring companies to consider, for example, the possibility of Scottish companies, and them being required to show that they had actually looked at possible bids from those companies and their explanation, as they would do on other public procurement, or would be done in public procurement contracts, as to why they've chosen one company over another. And also the other aspect of it, which is if one includes the sorts of requirements you've talked about, environmental considerations, or in terms of work policies, how workers are treated in countries where jackets, for example, are being fabricated. A lot of these considerations surely can be put in as part of contracts, some things that are required to be considered. So not just price, but also these other considerations, and they're thrown into the mix, as indeed they are under public procurement contracts at the minute under EU rules. Surely that's
you're quite right. I mean, and what I would say to you is, you very ably presented to me all sorts of considerations. And I just want to refer to you to the fact that we're having a consultation about this very issue right now. I would suggest that you write down everything you said and put it into the consultation. We're absolutely looking to tweak the auction round 4 process, which we hope to hold at the end of next year. We're running a consultation about how best to do that. And I suggest that all the points that you raised in the question you addressed to me, that you put those in as eloquent a way as you did just then, and submit it to the consultation, because we're looking at all these kinds of tweaks that will help UK workers and will help drive economic opportunity in our country.
Thank you. And one perhaps final question from me, because I appreciate we're coming to the end of our time with you, Minister. I suppose ultimately one can have requirements or put these into contracts or require them of companies, but one has to actually enforce such requirements. And I suppose that one gets back to the political will or the approach to matters, because clearly it's preferable if things are done by entirely, or contracts or commitments are honoured. But ultimately, does it not come down to that if they are not honoured, that actually governments or those responsible for administering these have to enforce them?
I think you're absolutely right, but this is where I think we made a lot of progress this year. When I came into the job 18 months ago, people were talking about the 60% content. We had no idea what 60%, or I certainly didn't have any idea, and a lot of people I spoke to didn't have much idea of what that 60% looked like. This summer, we very much convened groups of people to examine what the content, supply content looked like. We've looked at ways in which we can have sanctions and actually have teeth on the policy. So it wasn't just simply a kind of airy commitment, and that if people didn't reach that, they just got a slap on the wrist. We're looking intently on how we can encourage and drive that content. We're looking at ways that we can actually incentivize and, if need be, penalize companies who don't meet those requirements. And we're doing all of this, Mr. Convener, in the context of an international legal system. We don't want to break a law or treaty obligations. And so we're looking at ways that we can do this in a legal way. And some of the suggestions you made are quite right. We're looking at those. And as I've said, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating at the auction round 4, where we're doubling actually the capacity that we want to see on stream. We hope and we fervently expect that we will be able to show a marked improvement in terms of driving up UK content. And all of these companies that I speak to, all the companies I've mentioned, fully understand this. That's why they want to invest here.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Minister, for taking time to meet with the committee today. Thank you. And at this point, I will, I think, bring the session to a close. So thank you, and also to your official, Sarah Redwood, as well. So thank you. And perhaps, as this is the final meeting in public for this year, also thank broadcasting colleagues and those in the official report team at the Parliament who have helped support us this year. So thank you very much. And I'll close the meeting.